My name is David Birdsell. I'm the Dean of the School of Public Affairs. And on behalf of the faculty of the school and on behalf of the college, welcome to Baruch and welcome to tonight's Ackerman Lecture. Like all Ackerman lectures, this evening presents us with an exciting opportunity to review central issues in social justice and equity. And the Ackerman Lecture Series means a tremendous amount to this school. It means a tremendous amount because it gives us an opportunity not only to hear from leading experts and leading practitioners in fields that are important to what we do, though that is surely central to this series. It also gives us a chance to reflect on those issues of equity, of justice, and the axes on which they are so frequently denied, and to think, as is always so critical for the students and the faculty in this program and the people in public life who come through these halls, how we can make that better, how we can address change. This lecture series would not be possible without the generosity of Erwin and Rosalind Engleman, who are joining us this evening and are in the front row here. The series is named in honor of Rosalind's parents, Lillie and Nathan Ackerman, who came to this country, immigrants from another nation, interested themselves in living a life dedicated to social justice and equity issues that they experienced in their lives and that they made sure that their children and their grandchildren understood. And one of those grandchildren is here this evening with the pleasure of introducing our panel and specifically of saying a little bit more about the person who holds the Ackerman Chair in Race and Social Justice here at the School of Public Affairs. I won't say anything more about the chair, but I would like to say a couple of words about Marianne Engleman-Lado. She is General Counsel at New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. She has had a long career in social justice herself, principally working through the law to make sure that people who are underrepresented can be well represented, and to understand how individuals and classes can achieve justice in highly contested environments, working in New York City and across the nation, and of course is now leading a national campaign to deal with the rollback of civil rights that we have seen over the course of the last 6 and arguably the last 15 years. So without further ado, I would like to welcome to the podium Marianne Engleman-Lado.
On behalf of my family, I want to thank you all for being here. In preparing for the honor of introducing Sonia Jarvis, the Ackerman Chair and Associate Professor in the School of Public Affairs, I looked into the origin of the saying, "We stand on the shoulders of those who come before us." It turns out that the saying is attributed to quite a number of individuals, from Sir Isaac Newton to Charles Darwin, both of whom are quoted to have said or written something along the lines of, "If I have seen further, it is only because I have stood on the shoulders of giants." The meaning is clear. We in the present generation, our perspective, our achievements, build on the efforts and struggles of previous generations. Indeed, my sister Madeline Cohen, who's also here tonight, my sister Madeline and I stand on the shoulders of people who not only struggled for opportunity, but also provided our families with a moral compass. Nathan and Lillie Ackerman, our grandmother and grandfather, came to the United States in search of freedom, opportunity, and justice. Their stories, in some ways, are like the stories of the families of so many Baruch students. My grandmother grew up in war-torn Russia during the First World War and the Russian Revolution. She saw very little stability in her childhood. She was torn from her home on a forced march. She saw her little brother die as a result of this forced march and disease. Family members were threatened at gunpoint, and never for a moment did she experience religious freedom. My grandparents' experience deepened their determination to make a different kind of life. And my grandmother's determination and dignity is an inspiration during those very few moments of cynicism about the possibilities of democracy. She never lacked hope. Indeed, though she and my grandfather never had the opportunity to go to college, even here in the United States, and had very tough lives working long, hard hours selling fruit on the streets of New York, or later maintaining a small group of bungalows in the Catskills during the summer, she was absolutely politically engaged. We still have her letters to presidents, ambassadors, and other elected officials. This week, I'm thinking of her belief as I'm reminded that political engagement can make a difference. We stand on the shoulders of those who built and taught at Baruch and City College, who provided a fantastic education and opportunity to my parents, Rosalind and Erwin Engleman. And we stand, Madeline and I stand, on the shoulders of my parents, who generously offer their time, and support and a deep commitment to social justice. They're here tonight, and I thank them. Sonia Jarvis has outdone herself tonight. She has brought together a fantastic group, and I'll soon turn this over to her to do introductions. But my connections to Baruch and to tonight's program are multi-layered and intertwined. And I have to tell you that I also stand on the shoulders of one of our panelists, Alex Polikoff. And I have to say something about him. He may not remember this, and he doesn't, but in the mid-1980s, after my first year of law school, I'm supposed to pretend he does, but he doesn't. After my first year of law school, I interned with him at BPI, where he still works, business and professional people in the public interest. I had gone to law school to be a civil rights attorney, but frankly, I was somewhat turned off by my first year law school experience. I wasn't sure that I could see myself as a public interest lawyer. He probably doesn't know this, but Al Polikoff turned it around. He had been struggling with the effects of the Gautreaux case, a groundbreaking housing case that he had won in principle, but that hadn't yet translated into tangible benefits, non-segregated, safe, decent, affordable housing for low-income residents of Chicago. One day, we had like a little brown bag, and an intern asked him, in a somewhat challenging and fiery way that interns have. An intern asked him why he wasn't doing something about unequal educational experiences in Chicago, because that was what really mattered. Al Polikoff paused, licked his lips, thought, at least seemed to think about the question, and then said something to the effect that he had no idea what to do about the mess he had made in housing in Chicago, much less how to be helpful in education. With tremendous sincerity, we stand on the shoulders of giants, made all the more great by humility and decency. And I went back to law school. Finally, our moderator and host for tonight. Her achievements are many, and I cannot do justice to them. I encourage you to go to the Baruch website and look at her CV. Stanford undergraduate, Yale Law School, teaching at Harvard, Georgetown, Rutgers, GW, and Baruch, a consultant and recognized expert on issues of racial justice and civil rights, an accomplished scholar, the Ackerman professor. She's devoted much of her career to understanding the interaction of race, politics, and the media. I'm very sorry to say that this is the last formal Ackerman lecture organized by Sonia Jarvis, because each has been a spectacular engagement in serious thinking about equality and justice in America. She has successfully sought to bring to the school experts on a wide range of issues related to equality and justice, including tonight's excellent panel with Al Polikoff, Phil Thompson, and Anurima Bhargava. It is truly my honor to introduce Sonia Jarvis.
Good evening. We are here to have a dialogue this evening, and that's going to be difficult if you're going to be unresponsive. First of all, I would like to thank the Engleman family, the Ackerman family, and those who have been so instrumental in creating a program that allows us to talk about equality and social justice in America. I'd also like to acknowledge the other members of the Baruch faculty and thank those who brought their classes here to spend time with us tonight. And in addition to Dean Birdsell and Dean Myrna Chase and those of you who have supported this program, I would like to thank you personally for all of the support you have provided to me. As Marianne indicated, this is our last formal lecture, but we'll also have a program in the spring, which I'll tell you more about later in this program. Tonight, we're going to talk about a topic that is very close to my heart. It's one that I've spent most of my career developing the notion of how do we approach race and social justice in America. I have the honor of teaching on that topic this semester, and I see most of my students are here today, and I will be expecting you to be prepared to ask some very provocative questions of our panelists. I've warned them already, so they're ready for you. Secondly, I'd like to thank my parents who were brought up in Tidewater, Virginia, in the Virginia Beach area. They lived in the segregated South, yet they raised their 5 children to be optimistic and not bitter about race. Although some of my students can tell you that I always have something special to say about Virginia. And this week is no exception. In trying to put together tonight's panel, I wanted to provide you with a range of experts, from those who have been fighting the battle for the last 40 or 50 years, to those who have just joined the struggle to provide equal educational opportunity, and against that backdrop, talk about how America has changed over the last 40 or 50 years since Brown versus Board of Education was rendered by the Supreme Court. My students can also tell you that they cannot get out of one of my courses without learning about Brown versus Board of Education. The reason for that, among others, is because of its profound effect on American society by allowing us to make true the promises of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. Without Brown, I'm not sure Baruch would be the institution it is today. I know my life and my life chances would not have been the same without a single Supreme Court decision. But we also know that what the Supreme Court can give, it can also take away. And that's the reason it's so important to have an understanding of how public policies affect all of us, but especially those that have a racial impact. We can look at Hurricane Katrina and its aftermath as just one reminder that public policies that have a racial impact are not mere intellectual exercises. If the government treats one group like second-class citizens, or worse, the consequences can be fatal. And if we don't take that lesson to heart, we will be condemned to repeating the mistakes of the past. We can look at the results of the election earlier this week and recognize that the framers got a number of things right, that any time power goes unchecked, it's usually not to the benefit of the American people. We have seen the American people over the last 50 years, for the most part, engage in divided government, one that allows for checks and balances. And as we go forward from this midterm election, we will have to see whether or not the party that has just taken control of Congress can exercise its power responsibly. When we look at the exit polls from this week, we can see certain patterns that I think we'll have some time to talk about through the course of this evening. We can see that the Republican Party was isolated in the South, with the Democratic Party winning in the Midwest for the first time in a decade. What are those patterns about? What does race have to do with that? Unfortunately, quite a bit. We can also see that the gains that the Republican Party made with Hispanic voters in 2004 were basically reversed in this most recent election. I think that's an interesting statistic as we look towards the Hispanic community as the largest minority and understand the role that it can have in party politics moving forward. We can look at the result in Virginia. And in that case, it wasn't so much about race as it was about gender politics, where the so-called gender gap reemerged. 55% of women supported the Democratic candidate, 55% of men supported the Republican candidate. What does that mean for our nation as we go forward? We know that our politics are very divided. 2006 was just another example of a pattern that's been in place since 1998. That has not changed with one election. But we will see, as the white vote continues to be equally divided between Democrats and Republicans, that it will be the minority groups in America that determine national politics. And I think that is a result that we might not have been able to predict 30 years ago. Now, as we look towards the future, and that's what this panel is really about too, to take note of the past, but also to take note of directions for the future, I would like to start our panel by having Alexander Polikoff as our leadoff speaker. He was the lead counsel on a case that's lasted nearly 40 years. Let me say that again, on a case that lasted almost 40 years. I know something about pro bono clients. I had one come into my office, and 10 years later, I was able to finally send him home. And so to have a pro bono client that lasts for 40 years, your entire career, is beyond remarkable. About 7 years ago, Alexander stepped down as Executive Director of Business and Professional People for the Public Interest that Marianne noted to you earlier, which was a Chicago-based public interest law and policy center. He held that position for 29 years, just about half the time of the case. He continues to serve on the legal staff there and retains responsibility for the litigation that started with Gautreaux versus Chicago Public Housing Authority. Before joining BPI in April of 1970, he was with the Chicago law firm of Schiff, Hardin, and Waite, and received his bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Chicago. The latter was in English language and literature, and a JD from the University of Chicago Law School, where he also served as editor-in-chief. Polikoff has served as a director and general counsel for the ACLU and is a former ACLU board member. Now, instead of just spending time thinking about the case, he decided to put it in a book for you, and we've provided the book, and we'll also be talking about some of the points he raises in the book. In particular, how do we even understand the concept of racial integration today? So against that backdrop, I would like to invite Alexander Polikoff to the podium.
Well, thank you for that generous introduction. I'm grateful and honored to be asked to participate in the Lillie and Nathan Ackerman lecture series on equality and justice in America. And I'm grateful and honored to have Marianne remember her service at BPI. She knew that I didn't remember, and she was very gracious about that, and I appreciate that. The topic for this year, Race in America, Advancing Equality in the 21st Century, is a challenging one for two reasons. The first is the age-old reason that's been around since before we existed as a nation. It's always been challenging in these United States to look at equality questions through a racial lens, ever since the first slave ship sailed from New England in 1637. The second is a newer reason. Given what's going on in the country these days, deep-fixing habeas corpus, condoning torture, and all the rest of it, one almost feels like apologizing for talking about something as parochial sounding as race and equality. Optimist that I am, I believe the country will survive its present travails, and I also believe that what we do or don't do about racial inequality in America will have an important bearing on what that surviving country looks like. So I'm going to talk about race and equality in America, and do so by addressing a particular, but in my opinion, a profoundly significant issue, that of the African American ghetto. I'll begin by referring to an anniversary, the 40th anniversary of the 1966 open housing marches in my hometown of Chicago, led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his very first attempt to bring the Southern Civil Rights Movement outside the Deep South. The target of the movement inside the South, of course, was Jim Crowism, but the target outside the South was to be ghettoism. Seared by the 1965 Watts riot in Los Angeles, Dr. King had come to believe that the plight of millions of African Americans confined to big city ghettos in the North and West was as pressing as the travail of Black Americans imprisoned in the South's unique form of serfdom. And he knew that most Americans treated the Black Ghetto like the furniture in the room. That is, they accepted it uncritically as a timeless feature of American cityscapes. I'll pass over the details of that 1966 Chicago summer and move directly to the climactic event. Exactly 40 years ago this past August, Dr. King and the Chicago Freedom Movement reached accord with Mayor Richard J. Daley, father of the present mayor, and the Chicago civic establishment on a so-called summit agreement hammered out in St. James Episcopal Church under the stewardship of Thomas Ayers, who was the CEO of Commonwealth Edison Company and a pillar of Chicago's civic leadership. The agreement was designed to open up the city over time to ghetto-confined Black Americans, thereby to enable them to move into the city's economic mainstream. An organization was created called the Leadership Council for Metropolitan Open Communities to see to it that the summit agreement promises were carried out. The council's board of directors was drawn from the very top layer of Chicago's business, civic, and religious establishment, and included the Catholic Archbishop himself. The 40th anniversary of all that 1966 activity has, of course, occasioned much reflection in Chicago. Passing once more over the details, I'll summarize in two ways. First, on June 2nd of this year, the Leadership Council closed its doors and went out of business. The council's deathbed statement acknowledged that its work was incomplete, but said that it no longer had the support it needed to continue. The board of directors that dictated the council's demise was but a pale shadow of the initial star-studded one. Not a single CEO of a major corporation was to be found on it. The cardinal was long gone. The second part of my abbreviated summary consists of a few statistics from a recent report of the Chicago Urban League. This is what Dr. King would see, the report says, if he could magically return to Chicago after 4 decades. 74% of Black Chicagoans live in 22 of the city's 77 neighborhoods that are 90% or more African American. The average Black student in Chicago attends a school that is 86% Black. The report quickly notes that Dr. King wouldn't be bothered by these two figures because Blacks have some special need to live or study next to whites, but because separate is unequal in a nation where social and economic opportunities are not distributed evenly across geography, where residential patterns distribute quality schools, safety, public services, insurance rates, home equity wealth, exposure to crime and drugs, and so on. In short, where residential patterns distribute opportunity. Continuing with what a magically returned Dr. Martin Luther King would encounter in Chicago, Black median household income, 58% of white. 25% of black households poor, 5% of white households poor. More than a third of black kids live in poverty, 5% of white kids live in poverty. Of the city's 15 highest unemployment neighborhoods and the city's top 20 neighborhoods ranked for loss of manufacturing jobs, all are disproportionately African American, the great majority, more than 90%. There's much more, including rates of incarceration, infant mortality, and so on and so on. But too many statistics tend to glaze the eyes, so I'll stop here. I'm sure you will understand, as the Urban League report says, Dr. King would be deeply perturbed. I'm inclined to be a little more specific than that and say that 40 years after Dr. King marched in Chicago, ghettoism is alive and well in that otherwise revitalizing city. Sorry, that was just a water break. Wish you could save some of that applause for the end. I shift now to a different focus, to make some observations about African American ghettos nationally. The first is that they are growing, not shrinking. From 1970 to 2000, the number of urban census tracts with poverty populations over 40% more than doubled, while their black populations increased 12% to over 2.8 million persons. Yet the 2000 figures were, of course, a snapshot taken in April 2000, just as the economic boom of the preceding decade was ending. In population, at least, African American ghettos have undoubtedly grown even more since 2000. My second observation, Americans are more inclined than ever to turn their backs on black ghettoism. Ironically, civil rights victories, followed by the emergence of a black middle class, have encouraged the idea that the indolence of blacks rather than the injustice of whites explains the socioeconomic gaps separating the races. Cheryl Cashin, author of The Failures of Integration, writes, quote, "Many whites believe that blacks have reached parity with them. The fact that some blacks now lead powerful mainstream institutions offers evidence to whites that racial barriers have been eliminated. The issue now is presumed to be individual effort," end quote. My third observation is that today's African American ghettos are even worse places than they were in 1970, after the Watts and the other urban riots of the preceding decade. Those ghettos were, of course, bad enough. James Baldwin wrote eloquently back then of how the Black Ghetto was destroying hundreds of thousands of lives each year. Kenneth Clark's Dark Ghetto, published in 1965, tellingly described, quote, "the pathologies of the ghetto community and how the pathologies perpetuate themselves through cumulative ugliness, deterioration, and isolation, and strengthen the Negro's sense of worthlessness," end quote. But ghetto conditions have worsened since Baldwin and Clark wrote. The ensuing decades have seen the departure of low-skilled jobs for the suburbs and overseas, the arrival of crack cocaine, and with it violence and our war on drugs targeted on black ghettos. The riots of the 1960s were rage and fury, lashing out at the symbols of oppression, police and white-owned property. What's happened since the 60s may be even more disturbing. Instead of rage and fury, there is a life cycle, and perhaps I should say death cycle, of self-destruction through drugs and violence. My final observation is that the harms I've so far referred to, the harms to those who live in the ghetto, the harms upon which we generally focus on those all too rare occasions when we do talk about the ghetto, are not the whole of the harmful story. There is, in addition, the harm the African American ghetto insidiously inflicts upon the rest of us who don't live there and upon our country. Referring to those harms, Jason DeParle of the New York Times uses a striking metaphor, that of a poison in the national groundwater that is producing thousands of deformed fruits. How the poison operates is no secret. 60 years ago, Gunnar Myrdal, in his monumental study of race relations, wrote, "White prejudice and discrimination keep the Negro low in standards of living, health, education, manners, and morals. This, in turn, gives support to white prejudice." 40 years later, sociologist Elijah Anderson's studies of a black ghetto and an adjacent non-ghetto neighborhood led him to conclude that the vicious circle described by Myrdal was alive and well. Anderson found that whites in the adjacent neighborhood relied on race as their key to avoiding danger. "The public awareness is color-coded," he wrote. "White skin denotes civility, law-abidingness, and trustworthiness, while black skin is strongly associated with poverty, crime, incivility, and distrust." In American society at large, most whites act like those Anderson studied. Their public awareness is also color-coded, and they therefore steer clear of poor blacks and keep them in their ghettos. Predictable ghetto behavior then intensifies whites' sense of danger, validates their color coding, and drives their conduct. Well, if that's how groundwater poisoning operates, what are the deformed fruits it produces? DeParle gives several examples, but I'm going to describe one that he doesn't talk about, at least directly. My example of a deformed fruit is our war on drugs, targeted on black ghettos. Since Ronald Reagan took office in 1980, we have built over 1,000 new jails and prisons, many crowded beyond capacity. Crowded with whom? The answer is blacks from ghettos. By 1990, nearly 1 of every 4 young black males in the United States was under the control of the criminal justice system. Higher percentages in major cities. In his book, Malign Neglect, Professor Michael Tonry observes that the rising levels of black incarceration were the foreseeable effect of deliberate policies. Quote, "Anyone with knowledge of drug trafficking patterns and of police arrest policies and incentives could have foreseen that the enemy troops in the war on drugs would consist largely of young, inner-city minority males." End quote. One consequence of this may be seen in a simple arithmetic comparison. In 1980, there were over 3 times as many black men, in college and university as there were in prison and jail. 20 years later, 2000, the number of black men in college and university was actually fewer than the number behind bars. Part and parcel of our mass incarceration policy are harsh sentences for juveniles. 13-year-olds have been given mandatory life without parole sentences, and 3 strikes laws that mandate long prison terms for third convictions. You know that California has meted out a 25-year sentence for the third strike theft of a slice of pizza and another for the pilfering of some chocolate chip cookies. And heartless sentencing may not be the worst of it. The war on drugs, which is producing no demonstrable effect on drug availability, drug crime rates, or crime rates generally, is directly responsible for the drug black market and for the crime it breeds, while diverting funds from educational and social initiatives. In short, driven by a fear of black, particularly ghetto crime, as a nation, we are doggedly pursuing a mass incarceration policy that is both mindless and destructive of traditional American values. The incarceration rates in this country, which are profoundly racially skewed and profoundly swollen by the imprisonment of nonviolent offenders schemed from our big city ghettos, are unlike those anywhere else in the entire industrialized world. Brent Staples of the New York Times writes, quote, "The United States is transforming itself into a nation of ex-convicts," end quote. Maybe the consequence won't be riots and race wars, as Carl Rowan predicts in his book, The Coming Race War in America, but it will be disaster no less if American values are sufficiently deformed. What's happening to our African American poor may be the canary in our coal mine, a warning about Alexis de Tocqueville's description of racial inequality as, quote, "the most formidable evil threatening the future of the United States." And not so incidentally, Tocqueville went on to prophesy that we would not resolve the evil of racial inequality and that our failure to do so would eventually bring the nation to disaster. I know you'll understand that I'm not arguing that the deformed fruit I've described and the others I'm not taking the time to describe are to be blamed solely on the African American ghetto. Ending black ghettos wouldn't end anti-black prejudice any more than ending Jewish ghettos ended anti-Semitism. But it's not easy to find anything in American society that matches our African American ghettos for their insidious, corrosive, pervasive effects on the attitudes, values, and conduct of so many Americans. I want to note next that the doom and gloom I'm purveying flies in the face of what we might have expected over these past 40 years since Dr. King tried to bring ghettoism to the attention of the nation. Look, the Fair Housing Act outlawed housing discrimination. A sizable black middle class came into being. Welfare was reformed. Neighborhood revitalization became a strong national movement. Infamous public housing high-rises are being torn down. Even residential segregation has declined modestly in some places. Throughout most of the decade of the 90s, we enjoyed one of the longest periods of sustained economic growth in our history. We have experimented creatively with programs to assist the poor who didn't share in that growth, job creation programs, job training, transportation programs, school reform initiatives, new social service ideas, and so on. So what's the problem? Why, in the face of all the reasons to have expected the contrary and all the efforts to bring the contrary about, are our black ghettos still growing? Why are they worse places than ever before? Why must we live with the appalling fact that more young black men are in prison and jail and in college and university? Why have we been so unable to connect this population to the American mainstream? Some of the literature suggests an answer. William Julius Wilson writes that unless we reduce the segregation of poor blacks, programs that target ghettos are unlikely to have much success. David Elwood says the obvious answer is to move poor people into rich neighborhoods. Nicholas Lemon adds, for the ghetto kid, making it 99% of the time goes with getting out of the ghetto. Says Gary Orfield of Harvard, get them out of the ghettos. This is the most powerful way. In more formal language, Doug Massey and Nancy Denton, in their book American Apartheid, point out that for most American ethnic and racial groups historically, socioeconomic mobility, a fancy way of talking about getting into the mainstream, is a cumulative process. Economic advancement, such as a better job, is translated into residential progress, moving to a neighborhood with better schools, better services, less crime, a stronger community fabric, and the like. And that in turn leads to additional socioeconomic gains. Kids get better jobs, better education. And indeed, the history of most American immigrant groups begun in poverty is precisely one of such a journey. For most ethnic groups, residential segregation decreases as education levels rise. Indeed, most poor white Americans do live in non-poor neighborhoods. Not so, however, for African Americans who are poor. Ghettoism continues to bar most poor African Americans from taking the residential progress entry ramp to America's normal avenue of socioeconomic advancement. Okay, you may be saying to yourselves, but what can be done about it? It's easy enough to intone get them out of the ghettos, but can that phrase, that catchphrase, be translated into real-life terms? Well, at one point in our history, we were given a peek at a possible answer. For some 20 years, from the end of the 70s to the end of the 90s, a program in Chicago, growing out of the Gautreaux litigation that's been referenced, did get them out of the ghettos, the them being several thousand poor African-American inner-city families, not individuals, but families. The Gautreaux lawsuit included litigation against the Department of Housing and Urban Development for knowingly funding the local housing authority's practice of deliberately building public housing almost exclusively in black neighborhoods, thereby to prevent black tenants from accessing white neighborhoods through subsidized housing. Once HUD was found guilty, the question became, of course, okay, what to do about it. That question went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which in 1976 decided that HUD could be required to take remedial action throughout the metropolitan area, not just in Chicago, using the federal government's rent subsidy program that authorized housing vouchers to pay part of a participating family's rent in privately owned housing. Thus was born the Gautreaux Assisted Housing Program that employed these vouchers, supplemented by intensive housing counseling, to help poor African-American public housing families move to better neighborhoods. This was quite an undertaking because at that time, housing mobility, as it's since come to be called, was virtually unknown. Under a contract with HUD, that self-same leadership council that had been birthed as a result of Dr. King's open housing marches hired a real estate staff to persuade landlords to participate, counselors to notify families as apartments became available, explain the disadvantages and the advantages of moving, escort families to apartments in the council's inventory, assist in landlord negotiations, moving mechanics, and so on. Simply handing out vouchers obviously wouldn't have been enough. Over the more than 2 decades that the program operated, several thousand African-American inner-city families were enabled to move to better neighborhoods, most of them into over 100 Chicago suburbs. After a time, the experiences of the moving families were examined by a team of sociologists headed by Professor James Rosenbaum of Northwestern University. The team compared what had happened to so-called city movers, families who had moved to high-poverty neighborhoods inside the city, with what had happened to so-called suburban movers, families who had moved to middle-income, mostly suburban neighborhoods. Rosenbaum's data, which appeared in a number of journal articles and was summarized in a book, suggests that William Julius Wilson and Massey and Denton and the others were right. Living in a non-poor neighborhood may indeed make a big difference in the life trajectory of a poor African-American family, especially for its children. I'll never forget an awed social scientist in the audience at one of Rosenbaum's presentations. After she satisfied herself that she had heard correctly, she said that if by moving to better neighborhoods, inner-city families who were poor could achieve the life-enhancing results Rosenbaum was reporting, then policymakers should drop other initiatives and concentrate on housing mobility. Okay, by now I'm sure you realize that what I'm suggesting is that we should consider using housing mobility as an evacuation plan, as a means to begin offering a way out to those African American families whom we continue to confine in ghettos that are destroying the lives of thousands of persons each year, and as a means for the rest of us to at last begin to come to grips with one of America's defining problems. Of course, once that proposal is made, there's an obligation to consider the multiple questions and objections that undoubtedly spring to mind. What about the costs of such a program? What about suburban opposition? Administrative feasibility? Could enough homes and apartments be found in middle-income neighborhoods? Would enough African-American families be willing to participate? Even if so, wouldn't those left behind be worse off because the ablest and most motivated had left? What about creating new ghettos with clusters of voucher families? What about eroding black political power in institutions? What about eroding black culture? Aren't we saying that blacks must become like whites, that a black neighborhood can't be a good neighborhood? And even if you're ultimately persuaded that a national mobility program would be technically doable and financially feasible, isn't the whole idea some crazy political fantasy? Actually, I could go on for quite a while, listing questions and objections, and a full consideration and discussion of them would require another talk as long as this one, and I don't believe Sonia is going to give me that time. They are, of course, discussed in Waiting for Gautreaux in the context of the specific mobility program it advances. But here's where I've come to rest after considering all these questions and objections, the challenges and the multiple difficulties, and recognizing, as I do, that housing mobility for this population would be hard stuff, wouldn't in any event be easy. Here's where I come to rest. 43, and then I'll take a rest. 43 years ago, James Baldwin told it like it was. African American ghettoism, the modern successor to slavery and Jim Crowism, was destroying countless thousands of lives every year. And today the carnage is worse than when Baldwin wrote. Gunnar Myrdal, Elijah Anderson, Michael Tondry, and all the others tell us that our maintenance of the African American ghetto is having an insidious, corrosive effect on fundamental American values, on how we as a nation think and act. So, if Baldwin and Myrdal and Anderson and the others are right, as I believe they are, don't we owe it to ourselves and to our children to explore seriously any proposal that could conceivably ameliorate that awful carnage and that insidious corrosion? Should we not devote as much energy and ingenuity to overcoming the challenges and difficulties as we do to listing and describing them? Shouldn't our starting point be not why we can't do this, but rather how can we do this? In the 40 years since Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. tried to bring black ghettoism to the attention of the nation, we have ignored his challenge. I put it to you that it is time for Americans to stop accepting the African American ghetto as an unchanging part of their cityscapes. It is time to begin a serious dialogue about what to do concerning this most formidable evil. A good place to begin that dialogue is Waiting for Gautreaux, which is not only a story about a lawsuit. More importantly, it's an invitation to begin rearranging the furniture in our room. Thank you.
Mr. Polikoff has given us a number of important issues that are now on the table, but I know that some of my students are already prepared with some great questions, and we're going to start with the students before we open it up for the rest of the population. I ask that you provide your name, ask your question, try and keep it within some reasonable bounds just so we can try and reach as many of you as possible. So who would like to start with the first question for our panelists or a general comment to offer for the audience?
My name is Navita Bailey, and my question is more on, I was reflecting on your comment earlier about moving blacks from ghettos. I've noticed in the city that there's a lot of gentrification going on. And what's happening is that there's no need to really move blacks from ghettos to make things better, because what I'm finding is that people are now moving into the ghettos because things are getting better and it's getting transformed because there's so much gentrification. Big box stores are coming in, neighborhoods are being completely transformed, and they're no longer considered ghetto. So we have Red Hook that's being transformed, Bed-Stuy's becoming transformed, Bushwick and many other communities the demographics are changing and are changing rapidly. So my question is, as far as integration and changing communities and remodeling them, I'm wondering, is there any way that communities of color can actually transform within themselves so that they can stay there? Because what's happening is so many communities are changing rapidly that people are getting pushed out further and further. I mean, Brownsville was once this worst place. Now they have a co-op going there, and it's changing rapidly, and now the rents are going up there, and people are constantly being pushed out. So my question is, what can happen in these communities that there can be some self-sufficiency and, they can sustain themselves? Because right now, they're no longer, they're unable to sustain themselves. So.
The gentrification of white neighborhoods is not the same as eliminating the black ghettos. As I gave the statistics in my talk, and I won't repeat them, even while we've had a national movement for central city redevelopment, even while we have been tearing down public housing ghettos by demolishing the high-rises, those urban census tracts with 40% or more poverty, in which so many black Americans live, have been growing both in number and population. So don't be fooled by the fact that a number of urban neighborhoods are gentrifying and luxury condos are going up in what was formerly a bad neighborhood. All that's happened is that the severe poverty has moved to the adjacent census tract or 2 more census tracts down, and we still have this ongoing pervasive problem that we are refusing to deal with. The other side of it, can we fix up the ghetto? Can we gild the ghetto by development? William Julius Wilson said it all. I'll repeat this quotation. Until we deal with the segregation of poor African Americans, programs targeted on the ghettos are unlikely to succeed. And we've seen that historically with empowerment zones and going way back to model cities. It has not worked to eliminate the African American ghetto.
Well, I want to say that I used to be on the board of the Harlem Community Congregations for Community Improvement, a CDC in Harlem, dealing with exactly the issue you talked about. And we went to the AFL-CIO in New York State while we were developing a project north of 145th Street and asked them for $8 million, to help buy land. There are 3 ways you can influence development in your neighborhood. You can buy land, own property, you can finance the development, or you can control zoning through policy and politics. And typically, African Americans in Fort Greene, Red Hook, Harlem, don't have the money to buy land. They don't do the financing of the development deals. So the only thing they can do is try and exercise political leverage to slow things down or whatever, but that isn't enough to keep poor people in the neighborhoods. AFL-CIO said, yeah, you can have $8 million, but don't bother us with this little stuff anymore. We really want to make a big splash. We want to show blacks and Latinos that we're not just a bunch of crusty old Irish guys anymore. We really want to be their friend because we want to recruit them into our trades. In New Orleans, the unions are coming in and buying land. We're working with community groups, fighting out with developers who want to speculate and build luxury housing, and we're grabbing parcels of land before they can get it. And we're doing affordable housing, leveraging federal funds, merging it with union funds, working with community groups to bring displaced people who are poor back into the city, but we also want to get them into job training at the very same time. So that's the program and the package to prevent exactly what you're talking about. But I must say, New York has some of the wealthiest black and Latino organizations in the country. 1199 Hospital Workers Union has 250,000 members in New York City. It's Black and Latino. They have tens of billions of dollars in pension funds. They could easily buy up land from these, before these developers get there, work with the community to develop affordable housing, and exercise their considerable political influence to get a lot of government support behind that. It's doable, but we don't think that way. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. We have to start thinking about how to leverage our assets and our resources to get behind our, not just elect officials, but kick their butts and make them do what we want them to do, and then kick the butt of the banks and everybody else. I mean, that's what, and it's doable.
I would like to ask you to thank our wonderful panel for their time tonight.